Welcome to the Innovation Implementation Cycle Monitor and Assess training module. Your trainer for this session is Education Specialist Rebecca Peterson from the Utah State Board of Education. During this segment, we will focus on the tools that you can use to monitor and assess progress on implementation of the interventions and innovations that you identified and implemented in the stages of plan and implement. This segment will address how to identify appropriate data collection tools and how to create data collection plans. Effective data collection and communication provides objective information that is an essential component of the implementation cycle. There are many reasons why we use data. Data tells a story about where we are, where we're going, and for that matter, where we've been. It helps us to identify questions and answers. Data provides context for understanding information. It minimizes common excuses like, well, our kids can't do that, or students in rural schools, low socioeconomic status, large classrooms, students with disabilities, you name the label or the can't. It helps to minimize those excuses. Data provide accountability when they're collected regularly and reliably. At my house, this discussion revolves around the chore chart. Well, whose turn is it to clean up after the dog? Did my sibling do it yesterday or not? Data inform practice by helping us to identify what's working and what's not working. Data drive change. Think about feedback from the bathroom scale after the holidays are over. Of the various kinds of data we can collect, there are two key types that are critical for successful implementation of innovations and interventions. Fidelity data focuses on describing adherence to a defined process, and outcome data focuses on the results obtained because of the process. Both fidelity data and outcome data can and should be measured along the way, formatively, and at the end, summatively. For example, formative measurements of fidelity might include checklists that evaluate progress on implementing key parts of an innovation or intervention. As coaching and training progresses, fidelity measures can help to tell the story about how well the process is being implemented. And they can describe whether or not the process is being implemented as intended. A summative measurement of fidelity might be completed during a year-end teacher evaluation or by looking at a school year implementation data summary. Summative changes tell you about your destination. How well did we implement the key components as they were intended to be implemented? Where are we now at the end of the year? I like to think about formative and summative measures of fidelity and outcome through a chocolate chip cookie analogy. Let's say that I've identified a need. There is a distinct lack of chocolate chip cookies at my house to share with my neighbors. I need to make good chocolate chip cookies to address that problem. Well, let's say that I have a recipe that I haven't used before, but based on research in the vast library of online cookie recipes, I believe that the recipe has a high probability of success in making good chocolate chip cookies. In other words, I have selected an intervention. I need to implement the recipe to get to my desired outcome, which is yummy, shareable chocolate chip cookies. The recipe describes the key components that are necessary to achieve my objective. When I apply the recipe, I can choose to do it with full fidelity, following the instructions exactly, or without full fidelity, making my own adaptations, or possibly just forgetting to add the vanilla or the baking soda. The resulting cookie dough is the product of the fidelity with which I implemented the recipe. At this point in time, I can evaluate the dough and decide if I need to make any changes prior to putting them in the oven and getting an end product. This is an opportunity for formative evaluation. If I taste my dough and realize that I forgot the vanilla, I can make a correction and add the missing vanilla. If I forgot the baking soda, though, I may not be able to tell from just tasting the dough alone. I can look at the dough and collect some outcome data in my formative stage. I might observe that the dough is the right color, it's the right consistency, both of which are outcomes of making the cookie dough from a recipe card and following it with fidelity, possibly. But unless I evaluate the degree of fidelity that I implemented when following the recipe, I only have a partial picture. Summative data is what is available when the cookies are baked and ready to be shared with my neighbors, or not. If I experienced a cookie fail, what information can help me to understand what happened? If I followed the recipe with fidelity, I can conclude that the recipe itself was not the intervention that I had hoped for, and I can select a different recipe. If I didn't follow the recipe with fidelity, and I didn't track data to tell me formatively if I was following the recipe with fidelity, I cannot tell with any certainty whether the resulting cookie fail was due to the recipe, the intervention that I selected, or due to modifications that I made to the application of the recipe, fidelity of implementation. If I did not collect that formative information along the way, describing my path, I can only look at the beginning and the end. And unless I realize that I left out the baking soda, I might be tempted to throw out the entire intervention, ditch the recipe, and start all over again with something else. How many times do we do that within education? On the other hand, if I have some formative data that tells me about my fidelity and implementation of the recipe, I can go back and determine where I need to make adjustments. And lo and behold, when the recipe is implemented with fidelity, I get delicious, shareable chocolate chip cookies. Obviously, this is a simplified analogy for data use cycles, but I hope it helps to illustrate the importance of collecting both formative, beginning, and summative, ending data. And it illustrates the importance of fidelity, implementing interventions and innovations as they are intended to be implemented, and measuring that fidelity along the way. Researchers Horner, Sugai, and Todd wrote a great article called "Data Collection Need Not Be a Four-Letter Word." In the article, they outlined principles of useful data. The first principle of usable data is that it must be related to the decisions that are to be made. It doesn't do any good to collect data that are unable to answer the questions that we have. The second principle of usable data is that it should be simple and efficient. We tend to get stuck in the idea that real data is the process of standardized testing or some formal and complex process. However, there are many useful ways to collect information that are timely and are available. For example, one school implemented an intervention related to decreasing tardiness. A quick check of the hallways when the bell rang was their data collection. This provided right here, right now data that was easy to track and report. A third principle of usable data is that it must be used locally within the school setting. Data that are collected just to be sent somewhere else and then never viewed again at the school level is an opportunity lost. The final principle of usable data is to design repeating cycles of data use. Determine when you will measure and evaluate results so that the information can be used to help guide decisions and actions. Make this a regular occurrence, not a one-time event. We're going to talk about the 4 areas that you're going to want to consider as you create a data use plan. The first thing that you'll want to consider when you're planning how you're going to monitor and assess the implementation and impact of your innovation or intervention is to determine what you will measure. Remember that decision-making should drive the data collection. Ask and answer the questions, what information do we need? What questions do we want to answer? What data will answer our questions? Ask these questions about both fidelity and outcomes. And ask these questions about what does this look like in the process, so in the formative. And what does this look like at the end, or the summative? For example, what fidelity information do we need along the path of implementation? What questions about student outcomes do we want to answer as the year progresses? That's your formative measurement. Or what questions about student outcomes do we want to answer at the end of the year? Your summative measurement. One quick warning on this. Sometimes people feel like the more data they can collect, the better informed they'll be. This mass collection of various kinds of data tends to result in becoming data rich, but information poor. The collection of data that are useful for answering questions and providing specific actionable information are where you want your focus to be. Be specific about what you will collect and what you will not collect if necessary. Keep your focus on data that answer your questions. The second component of your data use plan is determining when you will measure things. So data are only useful when they're timely. It doesn't do me any good to know what my speedometer on my car showed yesterday if I'm driving on the highway today. Determine when you will need the information so that you can make use of it. Define how often you'll collect formative fidelity measures to see how are we doing? Are we making progress? Do we need to monitor this on a monthly basis? Do we need to look at this quarterly? When are we going to look at these measures? Also determine when do you need those data so that you can evaluate progress and make decisions. Determine when you'll collect your outcome measures. Is that going to happen at the end of a semester? Is that happening at the end of the year? When is the end of that summative time frame? When is your destination going to arrive? When do you anticipate that you'll be there? That's where your summative measures happen. A third component of a data use plan is determining how you're going to collect those data. So first you've decided what you're going to collect, and then you're deciding when you will do it. Well, now you need to define how you're going to do that. You also need to determine how that information will be shared with your team. So this goes back to naming the baby. So who's in charge of collecting which information? How will this occur? What is needed to enable this data collection to occur? Who is going to look at the data to determine what story the data are telling? How will summarization of the data analysis and the sharing of that information occur? Will it be a collective effort during a meeting? Will one person or a group of people summarize and email the information out? And then a note on there also to consider, if you're looking at student data, how are you going to protect student data privacy? The fourth component is when are you going to review the data? So you've collected it, but now you need to review it to be able to do something with it. So after determining what information you need and what data will provide that information, when the data are needed and how the data will be collected and the results are summarized, the final step is to plan when you will review the data. Formative data should be reviewed on a regular basis. So this is like tasting your cookie dough. You want to do this regularly, especially if it's good cookie dough. Sometimes in an educational setting, this means reviewing formative data quarterly. Sometimes it's every other month, but it really depends on what the team determines is necessary for making decisions. Summative data should be reviewed at the end of an implementation period. For example, this could be the end of a school year. After analyzing and discussing which data will answer your questions about fidelity of implementation, so how well you're following the recipe, and about student outcomes over the course of a year, so what do your cookies look like? It is time to map out your data cycles. So now that you've defined things, we want to put it down in a plan. An easy way to do this is to create a spreadsheet or a table that you can use to summarize what data measures will be used, when they will be collected, and who's in charge. So naming your baby. In the example that is shown here on this slide, the type of data is listed along with the purpose or the use for that data. The months are marked to indicate when particular evaluations or data collections and review will occur. Developing a plan like this creates a clear understanding for your team and an expectation around data collection and use, and allows the team to effectively monitor and assess progress. Thank you for participating in this training module on data collection and use, and for investing in the success of your team, your school, and above all, for investing in the success of your students. This is the end of the presentation on Monitor and Assess.